Hello everyone! It's another day to learn and grow together. I am Mary Chris Jelugatiman, a BSN English 4 student. And for today's discussion, I will be presenting collaborative learning, which is one of the instructional strategies under Unit 2 Practical Foundations of Teaching. But before we formally begin, let me ask you a simple question. Have you ever understood a lesson better because you discussed it with a classmate? Maybe your classmate explained an idea using simpler words, gave you an example, or shared a perspective that you had not considered before. If your answer is yes, then you have already experienced something closely related to collaborative learning. But before I begin, let me go over the objective for today's lesson. At the end of the lesson, you are expected to A. Analyze the key characteristics and strategies of collaborative learning and their importance in promoting effective student learning. S. Apply the principles of collaborative learning by participating in group tasks that require communication, cooperation, and shared responsibility. A. Demonstrate appreciation for collaborative learning by actively participating, respecting different perspectives, and valuing the contributions of others. Now let us begin. What is collaborative learning? So when we say collaborative learning, this can be understood as a way of learning where students work with other students to reach a common learning goal. So instead of learning only by listening to the teacher or completing tasks individually, students are given opportunities to discuss ideas, ask questions, explain their understanding, solve problems, and learn from one another. Now, according to Herrera Pavo, collaborative learning promotes the joint construction of knowledge through interaction among learners. So, in other words, students do not simply receive knowledge from the teacher. They also contribute to the learning process by exchanging their ideas, experiences, and understanding with their classmates. However, we should remember that collaborative learning is not simply putting students into groups. Students may be sitting together but not actually collaborating. For example, imagine that a teacher gives a classroom management problem to a group. So instead of giving them the answer, the teacher asks them to discuss possible solutions. So each member shares an idea, the group considers the different suggestions, agrees on the most appropriate solution, and presents the answer to the class. So this is collaborative learning. That is because the students are not simply dividing the work and completing separate tasks. They are communicating, contributing ideas, considering different perspectives, and building a solution together. Now that we understand the meaning of collaborative learning, let us look at the characteristics that make it different from ordinary group work. The first characteristic is a shared learning goal. This means that students work toward one common objective. Their individual efforts are connected to what the entire group is trying to accomplish. For example, students may work together to identify effective strategies for creating a positive classroom environment. They are not simply completing separate tasks, but they are combining their efforts to achieve one common outcome. So in simple terms, students are not only asking, what do I need to finish? Instead, they are also asking, what are we trying to accomplish together? The second characteristic is active participation. Students need to be involved in the learning process by sharing ideas, asking questions, explaining answers, or performing responsibilities. For example, a teacher may require each group member to share at least one idea before the group creates its final answer. So why do you think this is important? That is because if only one student is doing the talking, the writing, and the decision making while others simply watch, the activity is not fully collaborative. Active participation ensures that students are actually involved in and contributing to the learning process. The third characteristic is interaction and communication. Students learn through exchanging ideas with one another. They listen, explain their reasoning, ask questions, and respond to different opinions. For example, two students may suggest different solutions to a classroom problem. Instead of immediately choosing one answer, they discuss the strengths of each solution before the group makes a decision. So this demonstrates interaction and communication. That is because students are learning through their exchange of ideas. They are not simply giving answers. They are explaining their thinking and listening to the reasoning of others. So through this process, students may clarify their own understanding and discover ideas they had not considered before. The fourth characteristic is positive interdependence. This means that students understand that their individual contributions are connected to the success of the group. For example, imagine that each member of a group researches a different part of topic. The group then combines all of the information into one complete presentation. So this demonstrates positive interdependence. That is because the members need one another's contributions to complete the task effectively. So if one member does not contribute his or her part, the group's final output may be incomplete. So in simple terms, students understand that their success is connected to the success of their group. The fifth characteristic is individual accountability. Even though students are working as a group, each student remains responsible for his or her own learning and contribution. For example, after a group activity, the teacher may ask individual students to explain their group's answer. So why do you think this is important? That is because collaborative learning should not become a situation where one student does all the work while everyone receives the same credit. Individual accountability ensures that each student is expected to understand the lesson and contribute to the group. So collaborative learning involves both group responsibility and individual responsibility. The next one is learning from different perspectives. Students have different experiences, knowledge, and ways of thinking. So when they collaborate, they are exposed to ideas that may be different from their own. For example, during a discussion about a student motivation, several students may suggest different approaches. So the group can compare these ideas before reaching a conclusion. This is valuable because students learn that there can be different ways of understanding or approaching a problem. Instead of immediately rejecting an idea because it is different, students can examine it, discuss it, and possibly learn something new from it. The next one is the teacher as facilitator. So in collaborative learning, the teacher remains important, but the teacher does not simply provide every answer. Instead, the teacher organizes the activity, gives clear instructions, monitors participation, asks guiding questions, and provides feedback. For example, while students are discussing a classroom problem, the teacher may move around the groups and ask questions such as, why do you think that solution would work? Or has everyone had an opportunity to share an idea? So this shows that the teacher's role as a facilitator because the teacher is guiding the learning process rather than doing the thinking for the students. The teacher creates opportunities for students to think, communicate, and develop solutions together. And now that we understand the characteristics of collaborative learning, let us look at some common strategies that teacher can use in the classroom. The first strategy is think, pair, share. So students first think about the question individually. After that, they discuss their ideas with a partner and finally share their response with the class. This strategy is useful because students are given time to develop their own thinking before communicating it with someone else. It also gives students an opportunity to compare and improve their ideas through discussion. The second strategy is jigsaw. In this strategy, Each student studies one part of a topic and then explains that part to the other members of the group. For example, if a topic has four major parts, each member can become responsible for learning one part and then teaching it to the others. This works as collaborative learning because each member contributes knowledge that the group needs. So it demonstrates both individual accountability and positive interdependence. The third strategy is peer teaching. This occurs when students explain a concept or skill to their classmates. For example, if one student understands a difficult concept, that student can explain it to a classmate who is having difficulty understanding it. So this will allow students to learn from one another rather than relying only on the teacher. It can also strengthen the understanding of the student who is doing the explaining because explaining something requires the student to organize and communicate what they know. The fourth strategy is group problem solving. Students work together to analyze a problem, suggest possible solutions, evaluate those solutions, and decide on the most appropriate answer. For example, a teacher might ask, what can a teacher do if some students do not participate during group activities? So students can discuss the possible causes, suggest solutions, compare their ideas, and agree on the approach they believe would be most effective. This is collaborative. That is because students must communicate, listen to different perspectives, evaluate ideas, and make a decision together. Collaborative learning also provides several benefits to students. First, it can help students develop communication skills because they regularly express their ideas, explain their answers, listen to others, and respond to different opinions. Second, it can improve critical thinking. When students encounter different ideas, they need to compare them, examine their reasoning, and determine which ideas are appropriate. And third, collaborative learning can develop problem-solving skills because students can combine their knowledge and experiences to analyze a problem and work toward a solution. It can also encourage active engagement in learning. Instead of simply receiving information from the teacher, students become active participants in the learning process. Another benefit is that students can learn from the knowledge and perspectives of their classmates. Sometimes, a classmate may explain an idea in a way that makes the concept easier to understand. And finally, collaborative learning can develop cooperation, responsibility, and interpersonal skills because students learn how to work respectfully with others while accomplishing a common task. Therefore, collaborative learning can support both academic learning and the development of skills needed to work effectively with others. At this point, we can see that collaborative learning is more than simply placing students in groups. Imagine 5 students sitting at the same table, but only one student is doing all the work while the others simply watch. So is that collaborative learning? The answer is no. That is because true collaboration requires students to work toward a common goal, actively participate, communicate, share responsibility, learn from different perspectives, and remain accountable for their own learning. The teacher, meanwhile, guides the process as a facilitator. So the key idea to remember is collaborative learning is not simply working together, it is learning together. To summarize, collaborative learning allows students to learn with and from one another through shared goals, active participation, communication, cooperation, and shared responsibility. Teachers can promote it through strategies such as think, per, share, jigsaw, peer teaching, and group problem solving. So as future teachers, our role is not only to provide information, but also to create opportunities for students to think, communicate, contribute, and learn from one another. Because a classroom becomes truly collaborative not when students are simply sitting together, but when they are thinking together, contributing together, and learning together. That concludes my report on collaborative learning. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope that you have learned something valuable from my discussion.